War is challenging, but some war movies are even worse. World War II gave filmmakers some of history's most compelling stories, tales of heroism, sacrifice, and human endurance in the face of unimaginable difficulty. But not every director who marched into this territory returned with honor. Some created such spectacular cinematic disasters that veterans were outraged, historians were baffled, and audiences were left wondering how films with such potential could miss the mark so catastrophically. The films we're about to dissect didn't just disappoint, they mishandled history, wasted massive budgets, squandered star power, and in some cases, managed to actively disrespect the very heroes they claim to honor. From bargain bin propaganda to bloated blockbusters, these misfires represent the absolute worst Hollywood has produced when tackling one of history's most significant conflicts. What makes these failures particularly shameful is that they had every advantage: compelling true stories, technical resources their predecessors could only dream of, and in many cases, survivors still alive to consult. Yet somehow they still crashed and burned. Ready to explore this cinematic hall of shame? Let's dive into the 13 worst World War II movies in Hollywood history. They Saved Hitler's Brain from 1968 stands as perhaps the most bizarrely incompetent war film ever made. This cinematic abomination began life as a 1963 B-movie called The Madmen of Mandolin, before being enhanced for television with extra footage shot by UCLA film students years later. The result? A disjointed nightmare where lighting, costumes, and even hairstyles change wildly from scene to scene. The premise itself defies belief. Nazi scientists have preserved Hitler's still-living head in a jar, hiding it in a fictional South American country while plotting world domination. The execution is even worse. The film's editing makes it nearly impossible to follow the plot, with characters appearing and disappearing without explanation. The infamous Hitler head, supposedly the film's centerpiece, looks like a wax dummy filmed through petroleum jelly. Critics have awarded it the rare distinction of a perfect 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, placing it among the worst films ever made. Time hasn't improved its reputation either. Modern viewers regularly cite it as a masterclass in how not to make a movie. What's truly remarkable is that a film about such a serious subject could end up so unintentionally humorous. And yet, nothing could prepare audiences for what Michael Bay would do to Pearl Harbor decades later. Pearl Harbor from 2001 represents one of Hollywood's most expensive and spectacular failures. With a budget exceeding $140 million, a cast including Ben Affleck, Josh Hartnett, and Kate Beckinsale, and the promise of bringing one of America's most defining moments to life, expectations were stratospheric. What audiences received instead was a glossy 3-hour soap opera that treated one of history's most devastating attacks as mere backdrop for a fictional love triangle. The infamous romance consumed nearly 2 hours of screen time, pushing the actual attack sequence, the film's supposed centerpiece, into what felt like an extended action interlude. Bay's signature explosion-filled style turned a solemn historical tragedy into a music video-style spectacle that survivors called insulting to their experience. Critics were harsh with the film, awarding it a dismal 24% on Rotten Tomatoes. Historians identified dozens of glaring inaccuracies, from aircraft that didn't exist in 1941 to battle sequences that defied physics and military reality. Even the dialogue became a punchline, with lines so wooden they seemed designed for parody rather than drama. Pearl Harbor became a textbook example of placing Hollywood conventions above historical respect. It made money thanks to aggressive marketing, but its reputation collapsed so completely that even Bay himself has distanced himself from it. The film that should have honored sacrifice instead trivialized it, turning real heroes into cardboard action figures and genuine tragedy into melodramatic fluff. The true casualties of Pearl Harbor deserved better, but if Pearl Harbor represents big-budget failure, 2018's airstrike demonstrates how star power can't save a fundamentally broken production. Despite featuring Bruce Willis and Adrian Brody, this China-set World War II drama about Japanese bombing campaigns achieved the rare dishonor of a 0% Rotten Tomatoes score and became an international embarrassment. Everything about airstrike screams disaster. The visual effects looked outdated by at least a decade, with CGI planes moving like plastic toys and explosions that seemed borrowed from a low-budget video game. The editing created a confusing narrative that jumped erratically between storylines without coherence. Willis, barely present in the actual film despite being featured prominently in marketing, sleepwalked through his role as if fulfilling a contractual obligation he deeply regretted. Behind the scenes, the $65 million production was plagued by financial scandal, with Chinese authorities investigating the producers for tax fraud. The film was pulled from Chinese theaters days before release, then dumped unceremoniously to streaming platforms internationally, where it vanished without a trace. What makes Airstrike particularly tragic is that it attempted to depict a devastating chapter of history, the Japanese bombing campaigns against Chinese civilians, that deserves serious cinematic treatment. Instead, it delivered a film so incompetent that it almost feels disrespectful to the historical events it portrayed. Some disasters sink quietly, but others involve sharks. USS Indianapolis, Men of Courage from 2016 took one of the most harrowing true stories of naval warfare and somehow transformed it into unintentional comedy. After delivering components for the atomic bomb, the real USS Indianapolis was torpedoed, leaving hundreds of sailors stranded in shark-infested waters for days, a horrific tragedy where many men were lost to sharks while awaiting rescue. The Nicolas Cage-led adaptation should have been intense and sobering. Instead, it featured CGI sharks so laughably bad they wouldn't look out of place in a made-for-TV movie. The direction lacked any sense of tension, with supposedly terrifying shark attacks filmed with all the intensity of a lazy afternoon swim. Cage himself, capable of brilliance in the right role, delivered a performance so wooden it could have floated alongside the survivors. Critics were very negative about the film, giving it an 18% tomatometer score, while audiences stayed away in droves. The $40 million production barely made back a tenth of its budget. Families of actual Indianapolis survivors expressed disappointment that such an important story had been handled with such obvious incompetence. The real sailors who endured one of the war's most terrifying ordeals deserved a film that honored their suffering with dignity instead of turning it into a B-movie spectacle. What's worse than a big-budget failure? A cynical cash grab. Operation Dunkirk from 2017 represents Hollywood at its most opportunistic. Released to coincide with Christopher Nolan's acclaimed Dunkirk, this bargain bin knockoff from notorious B-movie studio The Asylum wasn't just bad, it was calculatedly exploitative. The Asylum, known for mockbusters like Atlantic Rim and Transmorphers, outdid themselves with this particularly shameless production. Everything about Operation Dunkirk screams corner-cutting. The battle scenes feature perhaps a dozen extras running around the same small patch of beach. The naval evacuation consists of a single motorboat filmed from different angles. The German army appears to be 5 men in questionable uniforms. Most egregiously, the film barely attempts to recreate the period, with modern haircuts, contemporary speech patterns, and visible 21st century objects regularly appearing in frame. Critics who bothered to review it called it a cinematic failure and an insult to the actual evacuation. While The Asylum's business model relies on confusing inattentive viewers, Operation Dunkirk represents a particularly cynical attempt to profit from a historical tragedy without investing any effort in telling the story respectfully. Even straight-to-video deserves better than this. The Last Drop from 2005 attempted to combine a heist movie with a World War II setting, a potentially interesting mashup that collapsed under the weight of its own poor execution. Starring Michael Madsen and Billy Zane, the film follows Allied troops attempting to steal Nazi gold during Operation Market Garden. It sounds like Kelly's Heroes meets A Bridge Too Far, but the result is a mess that satisfies as neither war film nor heist thriller. Critics pointed to the film's identity crisis as its primary weakness. The tone veers wildly from solemn war drama to inappropriate comedy, often within the same scene. The characters are thinly drawn stereotypes: the tough sergeant, the inexperienced rookie, the mercenary anti-hero, with dialogue so generic it could have been generated by algorithm. Even the action sequences, which should have been the film's saving grace, are filmed with such choppy editing and poor lighting that it's often impossible to tell what's happening. The Last Drop ultimately vanished into direct-to-DVD obscurity, remembered primarily as a missed opportunity. A World War II heist film could have been thrilling and fresh. Instead, this potboiler delivers neither the excitement of a great heist nor the emotional weight a war story demands. But even a small failure pales compared to squandering a genuinely important story. Red Tails from 2012 represents one of Hollywood's most disappointing missed opportunities. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen, America's first black military aviators, who overcame racism to become one of the most successful fighter groups of World War II, deserved a film that captured both their aerial prowess and their struggle against discrimination. With George Lucas producing and a $58 million budget, expectations were high. The result was a visual spectacle with a hollow core. While the dogfight sequences showcased impressive effects, the script reduced complex historical figures to one-dimensional archetypes spouting cliched dialogue. The racism the actual airmen faced, systematic, institutionalized, and brutal, was sanitized into a few token scenes that felt more like box-checking than honest examination. Critics awarded it a mediocre 41% tomato score, with many noting that the important story deserved far better treatment. Viewers expecting a nuanced portrayal of these pioneering aviators instead received what felt like a Saturday morning cartoon with better special effects, all spectacle, no substance. What makes Red Tails particularly disappointing is that it had everything needed for success: an incredible true story, ample funding, and cultural significance. Instead, it delivered a film that trivialized both the airmen's combat achievements and their fight against racism. The real Tuskegee Airmen broke barriers in the sky and on the ground. Their cinematic treatment barely got off the runway. Windtalkers from 2002 represents another case of Hollywood sidelining the very heroes its story purported to celebrate. Directed by action master John Woo and starring Nicolas Cage, the film was supposedly about the Navajo Code Talkers, Native Americans who used their complex, unwritten language to create an unbreakable code vital to Pacific victory. Instead, the Navajo characters became supporting players in their own story. The film focuses primarily on Cage's character, a traumatized Marine assigned to protect a code talker, and, disturbingly, to eliminate him if capture seems imminent. This fictional elimination order subplot not only never existed historically, but shifts focus entirely to Cage's internal struggles rather than the remarkable achievement of the Navajo servicemen. Woo's signature stylized action sequences feel jarringly out of place, with slow-motion explosions and choreographed gunfights that transform a solemn historical subject into an over-the-top spectacle. Critics noted the film's confused priorities, with Roger Ebert writing that it makes the Navajo into subordinate players in their own story. With a bloated $115 million budget, Windtalkers needed to gross over $200 million to break even. It barely made half that amount, confirming that audiences sensed the film's fundamental dishonesty. The actual Code Talkers, whose contribution remained classified until 1968, deserved a film that centered their experience instead of using them as exotic backdrop for yet another white savior narrative. But some films fail in quieter ways. Captain Corelli's Mandolin from 2001 demonstrates how even prestigious literary adaptations can become cinematic disasters when mishandled. Based on Louis de Bernier's beloved novel about the Italian occupation of a Greek island during World War II, the film had everything going for it. A best-selling source novel, director John Madden fresh off Shakespeare in Love, and stars Nicolas Cage and Penelope Cruz. The result was an inert romance that critics called all scenery and no substance. Cage's bizarre Italian accent became an immediate punchline, while the chemistry between the leads was non-existent. The complex historical background, including the brutal aftermath of Italy's surrender when German forces attacked their former allies, was reduced to simplistic melodrama. The film's handling of the war itself was equally problematic. The occupation is presented as largely benign, with singing Italian soldiers who seem more like tourists than occupiers. The actual atrocities committed during this period are either ignored or sanitized beyond recognition. With a rotten tomatometer score of 29%, the film quickly faded from theaters and minds. Captain Corelli's Mandolin represents a particular kind of war movie failure, one that uses conflict merely as exotic backdrop for romance without engaging with the historical reality. The result dishonors both the novel it's based on and the actual suffering of those who lived through the occupation. But some directors aim higher and still miss the mark. Miracle at St. Anna from 2008 shows that even acclaimed directors can stumble badly when tackling World War II. Spike Lee's ambitious drama about Black American soldiers in Italy aimed to highlight the often overlooked contribution of African American troops. Instead, it delivered an unfocused, overlong film that failed both as drama and as history. At 160 minutes, the film meanders through multiple storylines without developing any satisfactorily. The tone shifts jarringly from magical realism to brutal war drama to courtroom thriller. Most controversially, Lee invented a completely fictional betrayal by Italian partisans that sparked outrage in Italy, where survivors of the actual Sant'Anna di Stazzema incident condemned the film's historical liberties. Critics praised Lee's intentions but panned the execution, noting that the important story was buried under convoluted plotting and inconsistent tone. With a $45 million budget, the film grossed just $9 million, making it one of Lee's biggest commercial failures. Miracle at St. Anna represents a frustrating near miss, a film with important things to say that undermines itself through poor execution. The black soldiers who fought against fascism while facing racism in their own ranks deserved a clearer, more focused tribute than this well-intentioned muddle. But sometimes a film's problems extend beyond execution to its very conception. U-571 from 2000 triggered international incident through its brazen historical revisionism. The film depicts American sailors capturing a German U-boat and its Enigma encryption device, a mission critical to breaking Nazi codes. The problem? In reality, it was British sailors who captured the first naval Enigma machine months before America even entered the war. The historical distortion was so egregious that British Prime Minister Tony Blair publicly condemned the film, calling it an affront to British sailors who risked their lives in the actual operation. Veterans organizations in the UK were equally outraged, with one calling it an absolute disgrace that rewrites history to give Americans credit for heroic actions taken by British sailors. As for the film itself, director Jonathan Mostow delivered a competent but unmemorable submarine thriller with Matthew McConaughey and Harvey Keitel. The action sequences are tense enough, but the characters remain thinly drawn and the dialogue laden with cliches. Critics gave it mixed reviews, generally praising the claustrophobic atmosphere while noting the one-dimensional characters. U-571's lasting legacy isn't its quality as cinema, but its status as a cautionary tale about historical responsibility. The film begins with a disclaimer acknowledging the British achievement, but that hardly mitigates the fundamental dishonesty of its premise. Some liberties with history can be forgiven. Completely rewriting who performed a crucial wartime mission cannot. Speaking of rewriting history, sometimes even modern technology can't save a hollow story. Midway from 2019 demonstrates that even state-of-the-art visual effects can't compensate for wooden characters and didactic storytelling. Director Roland Emmerich's $100 million retelling of one of the Pacific War's most crucial naval battles prioritized spectacle over substance, with mixed results at best. The battle sequences themselves are undeniably impressive, with meticulously recreated warships and aircraft engaged in bombastic combat. But these scenes exist in a vacuum, populated by characters who feel more like walking history lectures than actual human beings. The dialogue consists primarily of exposition, with characters awkwardly explaining historical context to each other in ways no real person would speak. Critics awarded it a mediocre 42% tomatometer score, with many noting the contrast between the cutting-edge effects and the old-fashioned, borderline propagandistic storytelling. Audiences were somewhat more forgiving, appreciating the visual spectacle while acknowledging the dramatic shortcomings. Midway represents a peculiarly modern kind of war movie failure, technically proficient but emotionally hollow. The actual battle deserved a film that captured both its strategic importance and human cost. Instead, it received a movie that feels like watching someone else play a very expensive video game. But sometimes the most egregious failures come from the classic era. Battle of the Bulge from 1965 proves that historical inaccuracy in war films isn't a new phenomenon. This star-studded epic about Germany's desperate last offensive on the Western Front was so geographically and historically inaccurate that President Eisenhower, the actual supreme Allied commander during World War II, publicly denounced it. The film's most obvious flaw was immediately apparent to anyone with basic knowledge of the battle. While the actual conflict took place in the snow-covered Ardennes forest during winter, the movie was filmed in sunny Spain with not a snowflake in sight. The resulting desert-like battlefield bears no resemblance to the freezing conditions that were central to the historical campaign. The tanks are equally inaccurate, with obvious post-war American Patton tanks poorly disguised as German Tigers. The battle strategies depicted bear little relationship to the actual historical events, with fictional commanders making decisions that would have been militarily nonsensical. Veterans who fought in the actual battle were particularly offended, with many walking out of screenings. Despite its impressive cast, including Henry Fonda and Robert Shaw, the film's dialogue and characterization remain stuck in 1950s war movie cliches: square-jawed heroes, sneering villains, and simplistic patriotism. Critics at the time noted that the film seemed more interested in staging spectacular tank battles than in historical accuracy or human drama. Battle of the Bulge exemplifies old Hollywood's often cavalier approach to historical events, treating real battles as mere settings for action-adventure stories with little concern for factual accuracy. The result is a film that dishonors the actual battle by turning one of the war's most brutal struggles into simplistic entertainment. The worst World War II films aren't just bad movies, they're missed opportunities to honor extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Whether through historical revisionism, poor execution, or cynical commercialism, these films failed in their responsibility to the past. The stories of World War II, both triumphant and tragic, deserve cinematic treatments that respect their gravity and complexity. What truly unites these cinematic disasters is their fundamental dishonesty. Whether rewriting history to glorify American achievements, reducing complex historical events to backdrop for romance, or simplifying moral ambiguities into black and white heroism, these films distort rather than illuminate the past. In doing so, they dishonor the very people whose stories they claim to tell. Great war films don't need to be documentaries, but they do need to capture essential truths about conflict and human experience. They need to acknowledge both heroism and horror, victory and loss, without reducing complex historical events to simplistic narratives. The best World War II films, from Saving Private Ryan to Letters from Iwo Jima, succeed precisely because they approach history with both creativity and respect. The films we've examined failed that test spectacularly. They stand as warnings of what happens when filmmakers prioritize spectacle over substance, melodrama over meaning, or patriotic mythology over historical truth. Real heroes deserve better, and so do audiences.